this on? There, now I hear it. Okay. Just wasn't coming through there for a minute. All right. Hate to interrupt conversations, but it is time to begin. Welcome, Mark and Amy. You guys have been here in Utah for a while, but it's good to finally see you guys here. So welcome, and Tim, we saw you not too long ago as well, so we're glad to have you back as well. Let's open up to number 622. It's my proverbial turn in the rotation for song leading, so 622. Given that the Collins family is here, I know this song speaks to what you guys are attempting to do up there in the Provo area, so very appropriate. So 622, we'll sing all three. There's a message true and glad for the sinful and the sad. Ring it out, ring it out, ring it out, ring it out. It will give them courage new, it will help them to be true. Ring it out, ring it out, ring it out, ring it out, ring out, merrily ring the word o'er land and sea. Still far from Jesus, many live in sin and doubt. Ring out the news that makes men free. To all the lost of every nation, ring it out, ring it out. Tell the world of saving grace, make it known in every place. Ring it out, ring it out, ring it out, ring it out. Help the needy ones to know him from whom all blessings flow. Ring it out, ring it out, ring it out, ring out the word o'er land and sea. Still far from Jesus, many live in sin and doubt. Ring out the news that makes men free. To all the lost of every nation, ring it, ring it out. Sin and doubt to sweep away till shall dawn the better day. Ring it out, ring it out, ring it out, till the sinful world be won for Jehovah's mighty Son. Ring it out, ring it out, ring it out, ring it out, ring out the word o'er land and sea. Still far from Jesus, many live in sin and doubt. Ring out the news that makes men free. To all the lost of every nation, ring it out, ring it out. All right, thanks for helping me on that one. Our next song will be number 959. I think this is a good song that will to prepare our minds for what we're going to be talking about tonight in class. Just a little talk with Jesus. And after this, Mark will have our opening prayer, followed by class. 959. And again, we'll sing all three. Trying to get the tune of the other one out of my head. I once was lost in sin, but Jesus took me in. And then a little light from heaven filled my soul.
Father, we ask that you be with Sister Carrie, calling from Mexico. Please forgive us, Father, in this sin. Help us not believe that. In Christ's name we pray.
All right, we are on. All right, let's open up to Mark chapter 7. We're working our way through Mark's gospel. It's a great gospel, as we've seen so far. But here in Mark chapter 7, Mark is continuing to record some details about the public ministry of Jesus. This chapter began with Mark recording some of Jesus' dealings with the religious leaders of the day, called the scribes and the Pharisees. That's verses 1 through 13 of this chapter. But following that, Mark once again turns his attention to Jesus' dealings with the crowds who were following him, where Jesus spoke about the fact that it's not what goes into a person, like the Maverick hot dog I just ate. That does not make a person unclean. But what Jesus dealt with is it's what comes out of a person that makes him unclean, him or her. And that was verses 14 through 23 of this chapter. So, since Mark's attention is once again on Jesus' dealings with the general public, as I'm calling it, it's for this reason that in verse 24, Mark records that after the events of verses 1 through 23 of this chapter, he records in verse 24, we'll just read it. It says, Jesus got up and went away from there to the region of Tyre, and when he had entered a house, he wanted no one to know of it, yet he could not escape notice. So this is another one of those scene or stage setting verses, as I've been calling them. But what's the information Mark records for us here, just right there in the text? What's happening? Just what is again, verse 24 is one of those stage setting verses that I refer to sometimes. In other words, there's a scene being made here. So what's the scene here in verse 24? What's happening? What does the text itself say? Are you in Mark chapter 7? No. Okay. Yeah, we're in Mark chapter 7, verse 24. Again, we're not looking at what the text means. We're just looking at what it says. So what's the scene here? Okay, so he leaves again. Goes to this place called Tyre. He goes to a house. Now, what was Jesus' intention in doing that based on the end of the verse? Okay, we might say he was trying to relax. Why is that the case? Okay? He's trying to hide. He's trying to get away from the crowds. He's already tried this multiple times. It's one of the features of his ministry. There are times he wants to get away. But the text says he could not escape notice. He's still being followed. But he goes to this region of Tyre. So one thing we should understand here is that this region of Tyre, it's an area located on the coast of the Mediterranean Sea. We remember that much of the focus has been around the Sea of Galilee, but now Jesus travels west, get my directions right, And he's in this region of Tyre, somewhere on the coast of the Mediterranean Sea. So in addition to this, what we should also know about the region of Tyre is that it was located in Gentile territory, and that's something that will become significant when we get to verse 26 of this chapter. And so since it was located on the coast of the Mediterranean Sea, it may be for this reason that Jesus traveled there, because it was far away from where he was. He was over by the Sea of Galilee, but now he's getting as far away as he can from the Sea of Galilee, going over to the coast of the Mediterranean. But again, this verse indicates that Jesus was still being followed by a large number of people. People knew where he was headed. He couldn't even escape into the privacy of this house that this verse mentions. We're not told anything about the house. We just know that that's where he went. Now, one reason for this, that Jesus could not escape notice, is because in Mark chapter 3, verse 8, we learned that people from this area, from the region of Tyre, had traveled to Galilee to hear the preaching of Jesus. So there was already people in that area that were aware of Jesus, and this is probably one reason he could not escape notice, because people already knew who he was. So that's verse 24. Any other questions or comments on verse 24? All right. Verse 25, Mark goes on to say, the text says, "But after hearing of him, a woman whose little daughter had an unclean spirit immediately came and fell at his feet." This continues to set the stage for what we're going to be discussing, but what's the scene here in verse 25? Now what is Mark telling us? She knew who he was and fell at his feet. But why does she do this? What else does the text tell us about this woman? Okay, we'll get to that in verse 26. But what about verse 25? She has a young daughter with an unclean spirit. What's another way to put that? She is demon possessed. Mark has been using these terms, unclean spirit and the idea of demon possession, interchangeably through his gospel, at least up to this point. So yeah, among these people that are in the region of Tyre that know who Jesus is, there's this woman. She's not named. It's just this woman who heard about Jesus, but she comes to Jesus. She's got this daughter with an unclean spirit. She falls at his feet. Now, what does that indicate when somebody falls at Jesus' feet? What's their attitude toward Jesus? Reverence. There's a certain degree of respect there. She's humbling herself before Jesus. And this is seen in that simple fact that she falls at his feet. Anything else on verse 25? Yeah, there is a parallel account in Matthew. Matthew does paint a different picture. We're not going to deal with Matthew tonight, but yes. Do you have in front of you what chapter that is, Jeremiah? Matthew 15, okay. Right, Matthew does paint a more detailed picture. But here in Mark, we don't have as many details, because one thing we know about Mark's gospel is just let's get down to business, just get this information out there to his audience, which we assume is a Gentile audience. Anything else on verse 25 here in Mark chapter 7? Okay. Verse 26, we find some additional information about this woman. The text says, "Now the woman was a Gentile of the Syro-Phoenician race," there we go, "and she kept asking him to cast the demon out of her daughter." So what do we learn about this woman here? Guy? Okay, she's a Gentile and she's pretty persistent. Now what's a Gentile? Anybody that wasn't a Jew. Guess what, folks? All of us in here, we're Gentiles. At least I assume, and none of here are of Jewish background. But we're Gentiles. This woman was a Gentile. We're also told she's of the Syrophoenician race. That's another way of saying that she was from this area, from the region of Tyre, that included the nearby Roman district of Syria and the larger Mediterranean region known as Phoenicia. What Mark is emphasizing to his readers here is the fact that this woman was purely Gentile, had no Jewish lineage. Now, how did the Jews feel about Gentiles? They shunned them. They were unclean. Exactly. Yeah, these people of the Syrophoenician race, they are from that area that the Bible otherwise refers to as Canaan, earlier in the Old Testament. But so that's what Mark emphasizes, that this woman was a Gentile, should have no association with Jesus whatsoever as far as the Jew and Gentile relationship is concerned. Anything else on verse 26? Again, these are all stage setting verses. All right, so verses 24 through 26, again, set the stage for us, where Mark is going to tell us about this woman who, as the song goes, had a little talk with Jesus, or just a little talk with Jesus. They set the stage more specifically for what Mark will go on to record in verses 27 through 30 of this chapter, where he deals more specifically on the fact that this woman, she was pleading with Jesus to cast the demon out of her daughter. In other words, what Mark does in verses 27 through 30 is make 2 points about how this unnamed Gentile woman's words influenced Jesus to do what she was asking him to do. Now, the first point that we'll glean from verses 27 and 28 is that the Gentile woman's words resulted in Jesus being willing to heal her daughter. We'll talk about that. And then the second point we'll glean from verses 29 and 30 is that the Gentile woman's words resulted in Jesus actually healing her daughter. Now, after looking at these things, one application we'll take from this is that our words to Jesus can sometimes have an effect on how Jesus works in our lives, and we'll talk about that when we get there. So let's begin by reading verses 27 through 30, and then we'll look at the points. Again, Mark chapter 7, beginning in verse 27, we read, "And he was saying to her, 'Let the children be satisfied first, for it is not good to take the children's bread and throw it to the dogs.' But she answered and said to him, 'Yes, Lord, but even the dogs under the table feed on the children's crumbs.' And he said to her, 'Because of this answer, go, the demon has gone out of your daughter.' And going back to her home, she found the child lying on the bed, the demon having left." Okay, again, this section of Mark chapter 7, it's all about this little talk with Jesus that this woman had. But there are 2 points that can be gleaned. First of all, her words resulted in Jesus being willing to heal her daughter. But this point is introduced with this statement from Jesus. "Let the children be satisfied first, for it is not good to take the children's bread and give it to dogs." Now, in this verse, Jesus is making a statement to the woman where the words that he uses really take on the form of a parable. Now, we've heard about parables. We read them before. What are parables? Okay, a lesson that has a meaning. Any other ideas on parables? Okay, using pictures of everyday life to make a point. Now, something else I've said before that you've heard me say is when we think of parables, we tend to think of these long, drawn-out stories. They are. But when we look at some of these statements that Jesus makes, Parables can consist of as little as one simple statement because of the fact that they use imagery. So a lot of the things Jesus says use imagery, and that's a characteristic of parables, the images. So with that in mind, what is the statement Jesus makes here? What's the imagery he uses? Say that again, Sandy. Okay, let the children eat first. Why, according to the text? Okay, so that's the imagery here. Children need to eat first. Don't give what belongs to the children to the dogs. That's the imagery Jesus is using. It's the point of the statement. So one thing with those images in mind, we see the images of children and dogs. We have to ask, well, what's Jesus referring to here? The children he's referring to are the Jews. Jesus' primary mission at this time is to the Jews. If the children are the Jews, who are the dogs? Gentiles. So we have to ask, how do we know that? Thank you, Sandy. That's a good way to put it. That's how they felt about the Gentiles. The Gentiles were dogs. It's the case. Now, at the time, dogs were considered to be unclean animals. They weren't the family pet. They were on the same level as pigs in the eyes of the Jew. And in some cases, the eyes of the Gentiles also considered dogs to be unclean animals. Since that's true, the word dogs at this time became a term of offense or an insult, and in some cases, it was used in terms, a word of rebuke. One instance where we see it in the New Testament is the Apostle Paul. Philippians 3, verse 2, Paul refers to evil workers in that verse as dogs. It's the way this word was used. This is the picture people had of dogs. Unclean animals, the lowest of the low, as far as the unclean animals go. But here, Jesus uses the term to make the point that what the text calls the children's bread should first be given to the children so that they would be filled or satisfied first, instead of just giving it to the dogs first. But notice he uses the word first. What does the word first indicate? Guy, go ahead. Okay. Okay, they get first shot of it. And what did you say, Dean? Okay, number one. But what else is implied by the word first? There's more to come. So the dogs are not entirely excluded. Give it to the children first. Then we'll see if there's something left over for the dogs. And that's the point that's going to come in verse 28. But anything else on verse 27? All right. Verse 28, the woman responds. What does she say? Okay. Now, what is she doing in saying that? Okay. She is understanding what Jesus meant. She is agreeing with what Jesus says. Jesus, you're right. But, what's the but statement there? What does the text say? Even the dogs get the crumbs. Okay, so this imagery of dogs and children is continuing. What's the picture in the woman's statement? That's it. Now, for those of us who have dogs, I know you guys do. I have a dog. We should be familiar with this picture. Now, at least in my house, whenever our family sits down to a meal, our little dog, faithfully, it's right there under the table, waiting for one of my two kids, if not both, to drop some crumbs. Great vacuum cleaner dogs make. I think this is a picture we're familiar with. The woman knows this. She's saying, Jesus, you're right. The children should be satisfied first, but the dogs under the table get the crumbs. What is she saying? We see what the text says, but what is she saying? What's her point? Remember, this is about the bread. What's her point? Okay, that might be it. Even the dogs are worthy to get some of the crumbs. But more specifically than that, her point is, even though the bread belongs to the children, the dogs get some of it inevitably. So what this indicates to us is that Jesus' statement in verse 27 is that even though his priority was to the Jews, there was still room for Gentiles to receive some of the benefit of the teachings he brought. So this should also help us to see that just as Jesus' words were in the form of a parable, this woman is building on that quote-unquote parable because she's using the same images. Jesus, yes, the bread belongs to the children. It's for their benefit, but the dogs get a portion of that bread too because the crumbs of the bread that fall go to the dogs. That's in Matthew 15 is what you're referring to? Okay. So yes, Jesus, that's another thing to bring in here. Jesus does not send this woman away. Instead, he engages her, and they have this conversation. Anything else on verse 28? Okay. So putting verses 27 and 28 together, the point we should see from these verses about the Gentile woman's words is that the Gentile woman's words resulted in Jesus being willing to heal her daughter. Now, we don't see that language in the text, but this conversation is headed in a direction where Jesus is beginning to be willing to help her daughter, even if he's not already willing. Now, that's something we can assume because in her words to Jesus, what the woman is doing is following the argument Jesus makes to its logical conclusion, which is that while the children of verse 27 receive the bread first, the dogs will receive the crumbs that fall from the table as the children are eating their bread. And so what the woman recognizes and what she is aiming to help Jesus recognize is that it is both the children and the dogs that receive a portion of the bread and the benefits it brings. So Jesus hears this. This creates a willingness to do what she was asking him to do. So let's go to verses 29 and 30, the second point. So the woman has answered as she has. And in verse 29, what does Jesus say? Basically says, good answer. And what's the result? Demon is out of her daughter. Now, has Jesus met the daughter? No. But the demon is still gone. He tells her, you're right. Good answer. Go. That demon is gone. So it's here where we see that what the woman said to Jesus had some influence on Jesus to do what she was asking him to do. But what we can't be certain of is whether or not Jesus was already heading this direction. In other words, we don't know if he was attempting to elicit that answer from the woman. But what we do know is that he was impressed enough by her answer to do what she wanted him to do. So he tells her, go. Demon's gone. Now, what we should also notice from this verse is that Mark does not record the command. In other instances of the casting out of demons, Mark has recorded that command from Jesus, get out of the person. We don't find a command here. So Mark's focus here is not on the casting out of the demon, but rather on how the woman's words from verse 28 led to the casting out of the demon from her daughter. Question? Faith is definitely involved here. I mean, we've already seen that in Mark chapters 5 and 6, that faith was a very critical element in whether or not Jesus could do something. So yes, she definitely has some faith here. That's part of the reason another reason Jesus agrees to do what she's asked. So that's important to realize as well, because that fits into the context of the gospel. Anything else on verse 29? All right. So verse 30, the story concludes. What happens in verse 30? She goes home. What Jesus said happened has happened. But she's lying on the bed, the text tells us. What does that indicate? Okay, she's tired. Why would she be tired? What's that? Okay, maybe she'd been sick, but what do we know about demon possession from the previous stories we've read? What do the demons usually do? Right, the person is agitated. Demon possession in the Bible is a very violent circumstance. We saw the what's called the Gerasene demoniac. He was running around naked, screaming. Demon possession, it's not a pleasant circumstance. In the Bible, if a person was demon possessed, they were tormented in all different ways. That was probably happening with this little girl before this point. But now the woman goes home. The girl is lying on the bed, no longer possessed by the demon that had been possessing her up to this point. She's resting. Instead of being tormented in whatever way by the demon that she had been possessed by. That fact alone, finding her like this, would have assured this woman the demon was gone. That's how Mark concludes this story about this woman's little talk with Jesus. Any other questions or comments on verse 30? All right. So when we consider everything that Mark has recorded in verses 24 through 30 of this chapter, the point we should be left with is that the Gentile woman's words had an effect on Jesus. Her words resulted in Jesus being willing to heal her daughter, and the woman's words resulted in Jesus healing her daughter. And so this section is all about her words. It's about that little talk with Jesus that this woman had. So what's the application? Sometimes our words can have an effect on Jesus working in our lives. How do we take our words to Jesus today? Through prayer. Keep that in mind. Our words come to Jesus through prayer. But those words can work. They can have an influence on how Jesus works and is working in our lives if we take the time to pray. Since that's true, the story Mark records in these verses is one that teaches us to pray. In some ways, that's what this woman did. She wasn't praying up.
She was praying directly with Jesus in front of her. So this story is also a story that teaches us that when we bring our words to Jesus through prayer, they must be brought with faith in the fact that Jesus will act on our words that are brought to him through prayer. And faith, we know, is there, because that faith was a necessary element if these miracles were going to occur. Any other questions or comments?